Hi, this is Christian Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is another 2 chapters of Inventing Reality, the Politics of the News Media. We're going to try to finish this book by the end of, Sunday. So it's going to be, pretty busy, but, we just want to get started. Remember, the Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the Google Drive link and please buy the book and buy all my books on Amazon. It helps keep these books in print, and you get a better retention when you read from, print media than when you read from, computer media. You get a better idea. So let's talk about the U.S. government and their people. Let's talk about the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government and its installation of fascist ideology, promoting white supremacy and anti-ethnic hate among their people. They are murderers. Their people are murderers. They shoot people all through America. They shoot in mass murder campaigns across America. We've seen so many mass murders of Hispanics, blacks, and Asians all across America because the Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States fails to address this problem of ideology, indoctrination, and fascism among their public. And it is a huge problem because they make their whites of America behave like scoundrels. And that is what it is. And then we should talk about the U.S. government itself, their Ku Klux Klan, wherever you look, whenever you want to look for who is going to be the more kidnapping, which government does the most kidnapping. Just look in your own backyard. Look in your own backyard. You look in your own backyard, you'll find the enforced disappearance capital of the world, the United States government, on orders from Washington, D.C., in an office in Washington, D.C., on orders of the President of the United States, as well as their Congress, causes enforced disappearances. Enforced disappearances is one of the most inhumane things in human rights law. You kidnap someone and then you murder them and mutilate them, and nobody knows their whereabouts. They have done this, the maximum, the one government that has done the maximum enforced disappearances is the United States of America. They did it in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, more than any other government. They are Ku Klux Klan fascist racist of the U.S. government. And that is why you need only look in your backyard if you want to find who is the most cruel and inhumane butcher the United States of America is. So the U.S. mass media, we talked about their problem. Their fascist, illiterate press. The problems are suppression, non-diversity of sources, poor balance, outright lies and fabrication, falsification, large omissions, non-balanced coverage, producing a propaganda system as a team with the U.S. government conspiring against the third world. They are, anti-ethnic, anti-third world, racist, and white scoundrels, and that is what the U.S. mass media is. We talk about the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, Readers Digest, Time Magazine, Associated Press, UPI, Reuters, and Press Agencie France. The mafia, quote unquote, gang of four. I call it the Ku Klux Klan mafia. Okay, so basically, the U.S. mass media are sick white racist scoundrels. They help their government in imperialism, racism, hate, violence against minorities, murder cover-ups, torture cover-ups, rape cover-ups, racist theft, and oppression. So let's do the quiz. Leftist dissidents in academia are fired and purged due to university complicity of the corporate military establishment, class, income, education barriers, racism, sexism, and ideologic orthodoxy of mainstream science. That's true. The leftist dissidents in academia are fired and purged due to university complicity of corporate military establishment, class, income, education barriers, racism, sexism, and ideologic orthodoxy of mainstream science. There are no genuinely left progressive analysis of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, only far right and centrist right. That's true. There are no genuinely left progressive analysts of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, only far right and centrist right. The Washington Post focused on ice cream and drinking water or soft drinks to trivialize the serious concern of protesters that marched on the Pentagon to end U.S. militarism in the third world. That's true. The Washington Post focused on ice cream and drinking to trivialize the serious concerns of protesters that marched on the Pentagon to end militarism in the third world. Public enemy number one of the United States was the People's Republic of China, which it said called for wars of national liberation and denounced the United States as a, quote, paper tiger imperialist. That's true. Public enemy number one of the United States was the People's Republic of China, which it said called for wars of national liberation and denounced the United States as an imperialist paper tiger. And finally, the American press had very positive things to say about Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, who murdered leftists, imprisoned dissenters, and abolished all democratic political organizations and newspapers. True, the American press had very positive things to say about Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, who murdered leftists, imprisoned dissenters, and abolished all democratic political organizations and newspapers. So let's get started. We're going to start on page 158, Doing the Third World. Despite a vast diversity of cultures, languages, ethnicities, and geography, the nations of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, with some exceptions, show striking examples to economic and political realities they endure, lumped together under the designation of the Third World. They are characterized by, one, concentrated ownership of land, labor, capital, natural resources, and technology in the hands of rich persons and giant multinational corporations. Two, suppressive military forces financed, trained, equipped, and assisted by the United States, their function being not to protect the populace from foreign invasion, but to protect the small, wealthy owning class and foreign investors from the populace. Three, the population, aside from a small middle class, endure impoverishment, high illiteracy rates, malnutrition, wretched housing, and non-existent human services. Because of this widespread poverty, these nations have been mistakenly designated as, quote, underdeveloped or, quote, poor, when in fact they are overexploited and the source of great wealth, their resources and cheap labor serving to enrich investors. Only their people remain poor. For the better part of a century now, successive administrations in the United States have talked about bringing democracy and economic advancement to the less developed peoples of the Third World, when in fact the overriding goal of U.S. policy toward these countries has been to prevent alternate social orders from arising, ones that would use the economy for the purposes of social development and the needs of the populace, rather than the capital accumulation process. The purpose of U.S. policy has been not to defend democracy. In fact, democracies such as Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia, and Chile, 53, 54, 65, and 73, are regularly overthrown if they attempt to initiate serious economic reforms that tamper with the existing class structure. The U.S. goal is to make the world safe for multinational corporate exploitation, to keep things as they are, even while talking about the need for change and reform. In all this, the U.S. corporate news media have been intentionally or not actively complicit. As one critic of the press observed, it is a truism that in U.S. foreign reporting, the State Department often makes the story, to which we might add, when not the State Department, then the CIA, the Pentagon, and the White House itself. The Vietnam apology. The U.S. press, especially television news, is credited with bringing the Vietnam War home to millions of Americans, thereby incited their impassioned opposition. Certainly, daily media exposure to the fact that the war existed served as a continual reminder of the seemingly endless and senseless nature of the conflict. But in fact, most of the really damaging news about the cruelty of the cost of the Vietnam War reached Americans through alternative popular channels such as campus teach-ins, student, church, and labor groups, peace organizations, the radical press, and the underground press. What is corporate-owned media left unreported was far more spectacular than what it reported. From 1945 to 1954, the United States spent several $billions supporting a ruthless French colonialism in Vietnam, but the American public was never informed of this, similar to the slavery of the United States. In the following decade, Washington assumed the responsibility for the maintenance of the South Vietnamese right-wing dictatorship, but the public neither read nor heard a word of debate in the media about this major policy commitment. In 1965, the U.S. government began a massive buildup of ground forces in Vietnam, but Americans were told that these troops were merely a small support force. The New York Times and other major news agencies knew the real nature of the escalation, but felt it was in the national interest to keep this information from the public. Reporters who covered the Vietnam War were expected to get on the team to share the military's view of the war and its progress, and most of them did. The press, with few exceptions, censored the worst of the war, saying that almost nothing about the massive saturation bombings of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the free fire zones, U.S.-sponsored torture, the Phoenix Death Squad program, the massive destruction of Indian Chinese rural life, the indiscriminate killing of the civilian population, and the dumping of 12 million tons of Agent Orange and other toxic chemicals on the countryside, the effects of which are still being felt in Vietnam in the form of premature death, deformed births, and abnormally high cancer rates. On those relatively infrequent occasions when journalists reported some of the more unsavory aspects of the war, they encountered difficulties. The experience of Martha Gellhorn, a veteran war correspondent, is instructive. No newspaper in the United States would publish the articles she writes documenting the death and destruction wreaked upon the Vietnamese peasantry. Eventually, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran two mildest ones. Gellhorn had to turn to the Manchester Guardian in Great Britain to get all 5 published. But she paid a price even for that. When she tried to return to Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government repeatedly returned down her request for a visa. When Nicholas Tomalin gave the Washington Post his graphic account of how U.S. troops gunned down Vietnamese from a helicopter gunship, the newspaper refused to run the story. Philip Jones Griffiths concentrated on photographing what the war did in Vietnamese civilians, but could not get his pictures published. I was told time after time that my photographs were too harrowing for the American market. After he eventually published a book of his work, the U.S.-supported South Vietnamese government prohibited him from returning to Saigon. A former staff member of Time magazine recalls that during the 1660s, she witnessed how Time rewrote the news from Vietnam because of weekly phone calls President Lyndon Johnson would make to Otto Forbringer, urging him to call his own reporters in the field liars. Some of the best reporters and writers at Time had in those days quit over the distortions. The My Lai massacre, over 100 unarmed Vietnamese women, children, and elderly men by U.S. troops was not publicized until a year after it happened, and then by a small independent news service, belatedly picked up by the mainstream press after initially being turned down by Life, Look, and newspaper magazines. The My Lai story was treated as an isolated incident, not representative of U.S. conduct in the war. In fact, the systemic obliteration of villages described as pacification was a commonplace occurrence and a conscious U.S. counterinsurgency goal. The murder of Vietnamese civilians on a much larger scale than My Lai was documented by 2 Newsweek correspondents in 1971. Newsweek refused to print the story for 6 months and would not release it for freelance submission to other publications. In 1972, the magazine finally ran a heavily cut version of the story. When the reporters asked to do a follow-up, they were turned down. Critical reports on Vietnam were usually treated by editors and public officials as an unpatriotic attack on the U.S. government and the war effort. As Time reporter John Shaw noted, for years the press corps in Vietnam was undermined by the White House and the Pentagon. Many American editors ignored what their correspondents in Vietnam were telling them in favor of the Washington version. Regardless of what the White House thought, most reporters actually were just as interested in having their country win the war as was the U.S. military. What they questioned was not U.S. policy, but the measures taken to implement it, not the violent intervention and all the suffering inflicted, but its effectiveness. One could argue that the news media's job was not to judge or denounce the war, but only to report it. But the criticism here is that they failed to report it honestly. Only late in the war were some atrocities revealed on television. The execution of Vietnamese resistance fighters by an American-trained South Vietnamese military officer, a naked Vietnamese girl running down a road in terror and pain after being napalmed. But the essence of the war, the magnitude of terror and its death, destruction, and atrocity were never shown. In that sense, the press, with its favorable treatment, did make a judgment about the war. Even among those whose job was to evaluate policy and express an opinion, the columnists, editorialists, and TV news commentators, there was almost no criticism of the premises and claims behind U.S. intervention. Few, if any, in the press questioned whether the U.S. had a right to inflict such death and suffering upon another nation. Few, if any, questioned whether the preferred goals to stop communism and Asian aggression and to build democracy were not a cloak for other interests. Questions were confined to operational concerns. Will our efforts succeed? Are we overcommitted? Have we seen the light at the end of the tunnel? Are we relying too heavily on military means? Throughout the limitless public discussion, the implication was that if the United States could have won, then the intervention and its dreadful devastation would have been justified. All the major TV discussion programs were dominated by official supporters of the war, such as Robert McNamara, George McBundy, and Henry Kissinger. Anti-war activists, including political leaders like George McGovern, were either completely absent or accorded scant exposure. A survey of the editorial stance of 39 leading American newspapers found that while several eventually became more critical of the U.S. military escalation, not one newspaper advocated withdrawal from Vietnam, despite the strong anti-war sentiments expressed by millions of people in the United States and abroad. If coverage was so slanted toward the official line, why do we credit the media with turning public opinion against intervention to bringing the war into our living rooms? Maybe the credit is not deserved. The study of TV coverage between 1968 and 1973 found less than a quarter of the stories of a 180 program sample concerned Vietnam, and only rarely did the stories include footage of combat. Pictures of the dead or wounded were featured in only about 2% of war-related reports. American battlefield dealt were never shown. Body counts appear only as pictureless statistics. Likewise, a recent Army study rejected the notion that negative press coverage was responsible for eroding public support for the war. The American people were alienated not by the news coverage, but by the casualties. After the war, the news media strove to put the best face on U.S. involvement, describing it as either a well-intentioned venture gone awry or a foolish mistake. U.S. intervention in Vietnam, declared Richard Stout in the New Republic, was not wickedness, it was stupidity, one of the greatest blunders of our history. James Reston in the New York Times chided those who thought that somehow the United States was responsible for the carnage in Southeast Asia. Assisted by academics and officials, the national media rewrote the history of the war, asserting that the United States had selflessly intervened to try to install a Western-style democracy. Left out of this view was any thought that our leaders had waged a horrific war in support of a dictatorship and against a largely civilian population to prevent a popularly supported but non-capitalist alternative to social order from gaining power. So this is, war for plantation slavery of the Vietnamese people. That is the war. After the war, the news about Vietnam was all bad. The country was reportedly impoverished because of economic failure, not because of the massive destruction of capital resources inflicted by U.S. forces. Little, if anything, appeared in the major media about the tens of thousands of Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, the tens of thousands of amputees and others permanently crippled and disabled by U.S. firepower, the 100,000 Vietnamese drug addicts hooked by the same suppliers who served the invading troops, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese prostitutes, petty criminals, mentally disturbed persons, and other victims of the American war. Or if the attention was given to that, nothing was said about U.S. responsibility in their creation. Nor did the American press give much attention to educational, health, housing, and agrarian development progress of the revolutionary Vietnamese government. Relying on the establishment news media, one came away with the impression that the U.S. defeated Vietnam rather than the murderous intervention was the only thing Americans needed to regret. Murder in Chile. In 1970, when a socialist candidate, Salvador Allende, was elected president of Chile and began initiating reforms, that country soon became the hottest story of news in Latin America. From the beginning, the U.S. press saw the democratically elected government as an ominous threat to democracy. ABC's Howard Smith observed that the new Marxist government had outright communist internal policies. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post pondered whether Chile's free institutions could survive what the Times termed sharp turn to the left, and a Los Angeles Times editorial discerned totalitarian inclinations in Chile. In fact, for almost 3 years, President Allende presided over a country whose citizens enjoyed a wide range of civil liberties, including freedom for all political organization, even rightist ones. Most of the television stations and some 2/3 of the country's radio stations were controlled by the opposition, as were all privately owned newspapers. The U.S. news media never mentioned these facts. The U.S. press questioned the legitimacy of Allende's mandate by repeatedly reminding his audience that there was a minority president having won only 37% plurality. The press never mentioned that a conservative predecessor, Jorge Alessandri, had also been a minority president, but not an unusual occurrence in Chilean multi-party politics. Not for that matter in American politics. Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Richard Nixon had all been elected with less than a majority of the popular vote. What exactly was Allende doing to deserve such a bad press? He was moving toward an egalitarian socialized society, having begun nationalizing the copper mines owned by U.S. multinational corporations. And under a statute passed in 1967 by a conservative Chilean Congress, but left largely unimplemented, his government was taking unused land from big estates and distributing it to landless peasants. Through a variety of government programs, agricultural production showed a dramatic upsurge. The inflation rate dropped by half, construction was up 9%, and unemployment down to less than 5%, the lowest in a decade. Beef and bread consumption increased by 15% in 1971 to 1972. A government program sought to provide every Chilean child with half a liter of milk daily. During Allende's first year, the economy enjoyed an 8.5% growth in the GNP, the second highest in Latin America. Generally, Allende pursued policies that threatened the prerogatives of the rich, cut into profits while increasing wages, and brought a modest redistribution of goods and service in favor of the poorer strata. In response, the Chilean business class withheld investments, hoarded supplies, and destroyed livestock. The United States eagerly assisted in a campaign to make economies green. President Nixon's phrase, by cutting off food aid, denying Chile any new loans, and cutting exports to Chile by some 40%, and imports from that country by almost a half. Only the Chilean military flourished, being the recipient of a sumptuous $47 million in aid. The U.S. news media chose to ignore the fact that the Chilean economy was under assault from within and without, and nevertheless had been performing more democratically than under previous administrations. Instead, the press ran alarming reports of impending economic collapse. By 1973, acts of economic sabotage and political violence by rightists had become a daily occurrence. The democratic government was overthrown in September 1973 in a violent coup led by right-wing generals who abolished the Constitution, suppressed all political parties, closed all newspapers except 2 right-wing dailies, outlawed all independent trade unions, and executed thousands of persons. Editorial opinion in the United States was remarkably mild, considering the press's seemingly arduous concern for the survival of Chilean democracy during Allende's tenure. The New York Times observed Dr. Allende and his Popular Unity Coalition, dominated by socialist and communist parties, attempted to socialize Chile. The government met stiff opposition from the upper and middle classes, and the armed forces, traditionally non-political, finally sided with the regime's opponents. These few statements carry a bundle of deceptions. The bundle of deceptions. The socialist and communist parties, who supportedly dominated the government, were duly elected by the Chilean people and adhered strictly to the constitutional procedures. They attempted to socialize Chile, but the Times did not explain what the phrase meant, what the government actually did, what the programs it started for the people. Instead, socializing Chile was presumed to have something reprehensible. The Times said that the government meant stiff opposition from the upper and middle class. In fact, it meant political violence and economic sabotage. Nor did the armed forces finally side with the regime's opponent. After much scrupulous neutrality, far from being non-political, they plotted and conspired from the first months Allende took power, purging their ranks, aiding their efforts of right-wing terrorists, and disarming the few on the left who had guns. For the destruction of Chilean democracy, the U.S. press tended to blame the victims themselves. Thus, in an editorial after the coup, the New York Times noted, "No Chilean party or faction can escape responsibility for the disaster, but a heavy share must be assigned to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself. Even when the dangers of polarization had become unmistakably evident, he persisted in pushing a program of pervasive socialism for which he had no popular mandate." The last to be blamed by the U.S. press for the military takeover was the military itself. Also free from blame was the U.S. government, which financed, equipped, trained, advised, and assisted the Chilean military before, during, and after the takeover. The leading U.S. newspapers took pains to report there was no evidence of U.S. involvement in the destruction of Chilean democracy. To reach this conclusion, they also had to ignore the economic war waged by Washington and the CIA's funding of the opposition right-wing political parties and media in Chile. When Allende was in office and long after his death, he was inevitably described as a Marxist by the U.S. press, which he was, and his government was also called Marxist, which it was not, being a loose coalition of left-leaning political groups, some of which were reformist and decidedly non-Marxist. In contrast, neither General Augusto Pinochet nor his government was ever described as fascist, which they were, by any of the establishment news organizations in the United States. Allende's democratically elected government was Allende's regime, while Pinochet's dictatorship was more respectfully described as the Chilean government in the years immediately following the coup. The day after he was murdered by the generals, Allende was portrayed unsympathetically in the New York Times as a man of the privileged class turned radical politician known for his handy ways and stylish dress. Then a few days later, Allende was very much a political animal, a small, stocky, quick-moving man with gray mustache, ruddy face, thick, heavy-rimmed spectacles. In contrast, the Times described the Allende executioner, General Pinochet, as a powerfully built 6-footer, energetic, and very disciplined. And until he never talked recently, never talked politics. He was also quiet and businesslike, and though tough, he had a sense of humor. Certainly, he was a mass murderer we could all warm up to. It was Pinochet's unmentionable fascism, then his vaunted sense of humor, that had the upper hand in the regime's treatment of political prisoners arrested after the coup. The tortures delivered on Pinochet's victims included application of electric shock to different parts of the body, particularly the genitals, forcing victims to witness the torture of friends and relatives, raping women in the presence of other family members, burning sexual organs with acid or scalding water, placing infected rats into the vagina, mutilating, puncturing, and cutting off various parts of the body, including genitalia, eyes, and tongue, injection of air into women's breasts and veins, causing slow, painful death, shoving bayonets and clubs into the vagina and anus, causing rupture and death. This is what the whites of Washington are up to. Remember that. By 1980, 6.5 years of Pinochet's rule had given Chile continued political and economic oppression. Yet the New York Times could headline a story, "Chile's regime sees new economic hope." A kind of positive framing never accorded the Allende government. In upbeat tones, the opening paragraph told how Pinochet ordered the construction of a new $20 million jail. His willingness to respond to prison overcrowding, the Times maintained, with a straight face, reflected both sensitivity or social criticism and a new ability to pay for public investments. Pinochet believed this policy of free market capitalism offered solution to basic problems like jobs, housing, health, and social security. The Times remained willing to give the free market dictator the benefit of the doubt, even if it meant offering double-think sentences like this. Critics of Pinochet's economic policies generally agree that the situation today is an improvement over the breakdown of 1973, but they emphasize persistent unemployment, which is 15% of the labor force, and indications that wealth is increasingly concentrated in elite, with wage earners and peasants making less than before. In other words, the economy had improved, but the people were worse off. In fact, Pinochet's critics did not agree that the economic situation in Chile under the dictator represented an improvement over the Allende years. Outdoing the Times was Shirley Christian of the Miami Herald. For years, she produced stories about how Pinochet was adored by his subjects, how he had rescued Chile's economy from Marxist ruination, how he was like an iron-willed father pounding up the head of the table, or how he was tough and in charge. He speaks his mind, peace, tranquility, order. Pinochet has brought Chile these things, not the tyranny of military rule, mass arrests, executions, disappearances, and torture. In 1984, 11 years after the coup, the New York Times was still cooing over General Pinochet, describing him in one news story as the Chilean president and Chile's leader, never as Chile's dictator, whose 68 years are belied by his boxer's physique, matched by a trim gray mustache. The mass murderer has a boxer's physique. He seemed relaxed and expansive as he sat down to breakfast in Moneda Palace. The Moneta's previous occupant, Salvador Allende Gossens, a Marxist, died inside. Allende was murdered by Pinochet's forces. Pinochet, continued the Times, has managed to stay in power through what even his opponents recognize as political acumen, not terror death squads and U.S. military aid. After chiding Pinochet for his excesses, the Times editorial praised him for having brought order to the street and factored in renewed economic growth, while the poor were consoled with record levels of social spending. In fact, Pinochet's policies brought a drastic drop in real wages and upward redistribution of income to benefit the rich, sharp growth in unemployment, a huge increase in the foreign debt, a fall in savings, massive corruption, and racketeering by the military, and heartless cutbacks for the poor. The milk program, the children, was abolished almost immediately after the generals came to power, and health, sanitation, housing, and community services were subject to drastic cuts. The public sector was sharply reduced in a massive bargain price sell-off to private business. In 1988, 15 years after the coup, the Times still could not stop heaping praise on the Chilean dictator for having transformed Chile's sluggish, copper-dependent economy into a success story based on private investment. The transformation would not have gone so far, so fast, had not his economists been backed by the regime's dictatorial powers. Reform attempts in such nearby democracies as Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador were even now continuing to falter. Here, the New York Times endorsed dictatorship over democracy as a means to creating economic success. But success for whom? Even the Times had to admit that left behind were large numbers of urban poor who live less well today than they did 15 years ago. What we were not told is that the prime beneficiaries of Chile's economic success, quote, were the top military and the rich corporate investors of the United States. For all their professed dedication to democracy, the U.S. media have been less critical of democracy's mortal enemies in Chile than of capitalism's domestic opponents. Stomping on Grenada. In 1983, when the U.S. government invaded the tiny and relatively defenseless sovereign nation of Grenada, population 110,000, in an unprovoked assault and in blatant violation of international law, killing scores on the island, occupants and defenders, the American press pretty much went along with it. To be sure, there were editorials in newspapers like the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times denouncing the invasion. The Post eventually flip-flopped and came out in support of the aggression. And there was a long article in the Times that, while not criticizing the invasion itself, raised questions about the Reagan administration's deliberate distortions and knowingly false statements in regard to the military action. The press also strongly criticized the barring of reporters and the censoring of information from Grenada during the first 2 days of the invasion. Overall media thrust, however, was to accept the action as a kind of natural happening. The first question reporters asked President Reagan during the press conference at which he announced the invasion was, is true of two of our helicopters were shot down? An inquiry that implicitly accepted the legitimacy of the attack, focusing how we were doing and not on what we were doing. Correspondents like Jack Smith of ABC News and commentators like Bill Moyers of CBS positively aligned themselves with the aggression, seeing it as a necessary mission, quote unquote, to restore, quote unquote, democracy. Most of the press went along with the White House claim that the invasion was a rescue operation on behalf of American students at the St. George Medical School. Time magazine headlined its cover story, Rescue in Grenada.
ignored were the medical students who testified that they were never threatened by the Grenadans nor by Cubans, nor ever prevented from leaving the island. The New York Times did mention these later students a week later in the 38th paragraph of an article on Grenada. The press accorded generous exposure to the official view that Grenada was a Cuban military bastion. Grenada's defenders were Cuban and extremely well-armed, reported Newsweek. Time described them as well-armed, professionally trained soldiers. They were reported to number as many as 1,000 to 1,500 Cuban troops. In fact, only 784 Cubans were found in Grenada by U.S. forces. Exactly the numbers said were there. Only a handful were military personnel, the rest being construction workers, medical personnel, and diplomatic personnel with their children and other relatives. On the second day of the operation, when the Reagan administration announced the invasion was not merely a rescue operation for the students, but for the entire Caribbean, the U.S. press lent along with the revised and expanded version. The administration claimed it had discovered enormous warehouses of deadly armaments and secret documents that purportedly showed that Grenada was, to President Reagan, a Soviet-Cuban colony being ready as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. Footing of seized arms caches supposedly representing a massive arsenal sufficient to arm 8,000 to 10,000 terrorists was given top play by the three major networks, the news weeklies, and most newspapers. American military sources say they were staggered by the depth and strength of the Cuban military presence, reported ABC. Eventually, when journalists were allowed to visit the island, some sent back reports indicating that the arms cache consisted mostly of defensive small arms, enough to equip an army of about 2,000, hardly the stuff to terrorize and dominate the entire Caribbean. Contrary to what the State Department claimed, the secret documents, quote unquote, contained no evidence that a terrorist base existed and that Cubans had planned to take over Grenada. The New York Times belatedly and inconspicuously reported the major media give these corrective reports nowhere near the prominent play accorded the government's original charges. All three networks accepted Reagan's view that tiny Grenada was of enormous military and strategic value to Cuba, and that the Soviet Union, without explaining why, except to transmit unquestionably the Pentagon's fantasy that a revolution in Grenada would allow Havana and Moscow to control crucial oil tanker lanes through the Caribbean. A CBS correspondent argued the U.S. government case in this way. The Grenadians saw their all-new weather night and day airport with its 10,000-foot runway built by Cubans was for jumbo jets carrying tourists. Washington said nonsense. The Grenadians said the new port facilities were construction for a banana boat. Washington said no way. Washington believed this tiniest Caribbean country was being redesigned from a tourist haven to a communist airbase and a way station, a stopping point for Cuban soldiers on their way to Africa, the East Bloc, and supplies on their way to Nicaragua. And what Washington believed was what the press told us. The State Department offered no evidence, nor the press demand any, to support the assertion that the airport was for military services. Anyone familiar with the special requirements for military airports, including the underground storage and special defense facilities, would know that the Grenadian airport was a civilian one and was being built not only with Cuban help, but with investments from a number of Western capitalist countries, including Great Britain. The experiments in grassroots economic democracy and social justice, which were the hallmark of the New Jewel government, constituted a side to the Grenada story that the press left entirely untouched. Under the New Jewel, grade school and secondary education were free for everyone from the first time. Free health clinics were opened in the countryside, thanks mostly to Cuban assistance. Unemployment dropped drastically from 49 to 14% in 3 years. Free milk and other foodstuffs were being distributed to the needy, as were materials for home improvements. Culture and sports programs were set up for young people. Measures were taken in support of equal pay and equal legal status for women. The government leased unused lands to establish farm cooperatives and sought to turn agriculture away from cash crop exports and toward self-sufficient production. None of these developments was reported in the U.S. media, either while they were happening or as a background material for the invasion. The 1984 election in Grenada, like the invasion itself, was a U.S.-sponsored and financed operation. The new National Party, described unblinkingly by the Washington Post as forged under the guidance of Caribbean leaders who worked with Washington in last year's invasion, won every seat in the parliament while American soldiers policed the island. The NNP, continued the Post, was singled out by U.S. diplomats in private conversations as the best vehicle to return Grenada to a stable government. Headed by a pro-U.S. unknown named Harbert Blaze, The NNP and groups sympathetic to it received substantial funding from various conservative organizations in the U.S. and from the Free Trade Union Institute, funded by the U.S. Department of State and AFL-CIO. After the New Deal government was destroyed by the U.S. invasion, unemployment and economic want in Grenada began to increase sharply. Oblivious to the possibility of negative developments, the New York Times talked about a new moderate parliament and prime minister committed to peace and stability, thereby implying that the New Deal government had been committed to war and instability. Since the avalanche NNP election victory, the Times claimed, Grenadians have been in an especially cheerful and festive mood. The only supporting testimony by Grenadians that the Times offered was from an unidentified young man who reportedly said, "We've got a good man Blair there now and everything's going to be okay. We've got the Americans with us." To the above case, we could add studies about how the media treated or mistreated Cuba, Zaire, Guatemala, El Salvador, Indonesia, East Timor, South Africa, Cambodia, Turkey, Dominican Republic, and the entire Arab world, including Palestine and most other third world nations and regions. Undertaking would fill many volumes. What becomes apparent in the cases already presented are the patterns of omission and distortions, specifically the way the U.S. news media leave unexamined the premises and self-serving claims of U.S. foreign policy and accept the White House perspective at face value, confirming critical commentary to operational matters, downplay or ignore U.S. sponsorship of reactionary repression and the repression itself, and suppress descriptions of the content of third world struggles for national independence, economic justice, and revolutionary change, reduce third world struggles to an encounter between a virtuous United States and demonic adversaries. I will deal with these further and other patterns in the next chapter. For the New World Order, Chapter 10. As seen in the previous chapter, the news media transformed pro-U.S. autocrats into tough leaders and popular insurgencies into totalitarian aggressions. This chapter offers several more case studies about how the press does its part to sanitize the use of U.S. force and violence against countries that adopt a course not in keeping with the interests of U.S. global hegemony. The totalitarian Sandinistas. The United States invaded Nicaragua 7 times in this century, crushing popular insurgencies occupying the country for an extended period, and then installing a puppet military autocracy under the wealthy Somoza family. Nicaragua was made safe for big landowners and American investors. Labor unions were enfeebled or banned outright, thereby helping to depress wages and keep profits high. During these times, Nicaragua had a rich ruling class and an impoverished people. 5% of the population owned 58% of the arable land. The Somoza family alone owned 23%. Almost 60% of the people were unemployed, and 50% had a yearly income of about $90. About 80% of the population was illiterate. Half of Nicaragua's children suffer from malnutrition, and almost half died before the age of 4. The press had little to say about these class inequalities and the role of U.S. power in maintaining them. Like so many other U.S.-sponsored dictatorships, Nicaragua was treated as part of the quote-unquote free world, to be defended from communist aggression by Washington's global military machine. In 1979, a popular revolutionary movement led by the Sandinista Party overthrew the Somoza dictatorship, but not before Somoza's National Guard destroyed 1/3 of the farmlands, hundreds of factories, and smaller workplaces, utility plants, and thousands of homes. 50,000 people were killed, mostly by Somoza's forces, and 160,000 were wounded or maimed. 40,000 children were orphaned out of a population of 2 million. In 1984, after 5 years of Sandinista rule, infant mortality dropped to the lowest in Central America. Unemployment declined from 60% to 16%, while inflation was reduced from 84% to 27%. The portion of the national budget spent on health increased 600%. Staple foods consumption increased 30%. Rural clinics, free hospitals, and vaccination campaigns produced a 50% drop in malaria. These medical services, along with an improved diet, brought a dramatic decline in children's diseases. Land was distributed to more than 400,000 families and to farm cooperatives. Over 85% of the population was now able to read and write at a third grade level or better. Like the Allende government in Chile, the FSLN in Nicaragua incurred the ire of U.S. leaders, not because it was a failure, but because it was beginning to succeed in ways that were inimical to the interests of wealthy owners and corporate investors, most of whom believed that if rolling back poverty was to be accomplished by infringing on their class privilege, then poverty would have to stay put. The Reagan administration cut off all aid and trade to Nicaragua, imposing a crippling economic embargo on that country. U.S. forces mined Nicaragua's harbors, blew up its oil depots, and openly armed, trained, and financed a mercenary of Contras who engaged in a premeditated war of bloody attrition to terrorize civilian non-combatants. U.S. fleets stood at the ready off both Nicaraguan coasts and U.S. planes, regularly invaded that country's airspace. President Reagan said he wanted the Sandinistas to cry uncle, and Secretary of State Schultz promised to cast out the Sandinistas from our hemisphere. Yet in 1984, when Managua charged that Washington was pursuing a policy of aggression against Nicaragua and was planning an invasion, ABC News dismissed this as the Sandinista paranoia and the Washington Post as Nicaragua paranoia. The paranoia diagnosis was inadvertently put to the test in June 1985 when Reagan and Schultz both announced that the United States might have to invade Nicaragua before too long. U.S. leaders sold their interventionist policy to the American public by wrapping themselves in the mantle of peace and democracy. First, they claimed that they were intervening in Nicaragua to interdict Sandinista weapons that supposedly were being sent to Salvadoran rebels, even though the arms were flowing the other way, from El Salvador to the U.S.-sponsored Contras. Then they claimed it was to prevent the Sandinistas from carrying out a plan of aggression against its neighbors. Next, it was to force democratic reforms within Nicaragua. Even a cub reporter grew skeptical about a courtroom defendant who continually changes his alibi. Yet many veteran journalists hardly blinked at the ever-changing rationale invoked to justify U.S. support for the Contras. Each day, the White House, State Department, and Pentagon flooded the news medias with scores of press releases, briefings, leaks, stage events, and interviews, saturating a receptive press with anti-Sandinista propaganda. While the U.S. media uncritically disseminated the White House charges of Sandinista totalitarianism, elections were held in Nicaragua in 1984. 7 parties ran for seats in the National Assembly and for presidency, representing a broad ideologic range from left to right. Regardless of size, all parties enjoyed relatively easy ballot access, public financing of $12 million Cordobas, about 12 million Cordobas, about $431,000, and an equal amount of time each day on the state-run radio stations and television channels. Each party was also permitted to receive unlimited funds from private donors, including organizations outside of Nicaragua, a provision that worked to advantage of the more affluent conservative candidates. Some 460 official foreign observers from all over the world, who were free to check all aspects of the voting process and ballot counting, agreed that with the exception of a few incidents, the campaign was fair, honest, and non-coercive. Yet these democratic efforts would scant and skeptical coverage in the U.S. media. The impression left by the media was that if the FSLN were to win, then the election could simply not be considered democratic. Stories carried in the New York Times were typically headlined, "Sandinistas may win big in the election, but against whom?" And going through motions in Nicaragua, the gist of articles being that the election was somehow rigged by the Sandinistas. A Washington Post story headline, "Controversial Vote Set Today in Nicaragua," emphasized the pervasive presence in the society of FSLN supporters, thereby treating the Sandinista popularity as a sign of undemocratic political monopoly. The Sandinistas won the 1984 election with almost 65% of the vote, while 2 conservative parties cleaned 13% and 9%, respectively. Since the National Assembly had proportional representation, the minority parties were assured of seats. Ignoring the realities of the Nicaraguan election, an editorial in the New York Times several months later attacked the Sandinistas for refusing to subject their power to the consent of the Nicaraguan people. Much was made of the fact that on a number of occasions, the Nicaraguan government censored pages in La Prensa or suspended publication for brief periods. La Prensa was a right-wing daily that received funds from the U.S. Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy. It openly supported the U.S. financed Contra Army and had several Contra members on its editorial board, yet it was allowed to continue publication throughout the war. La Prensa was not only opposition voice. About half the radio and television stations in Nicaragua were privately owned, and many of these gave the government a daily ideologic pounding of a kind that made the U.S. mainstream press look like tepid observers, like tepid establishment mouthpiece it is. Nicaragua was under the invasion from hostile forces and had suffered much of the life and destruction of property, yet the totalitarian censorship imposed by the Sandinistas was much less restrictive than what the U.S. government imposed during World War I and World War II. By 1990, the conditions in Nicaragua had gone from worse due to the punishing effects of U.S.-sponsored war and U.S. economic sanctions. In the national election that year, the Sandinistas faced a coalition of opposition parties, that was heavily financed by the U.S. government. In anticipation of another possible Sandinista victory, the U.S. media once more began to question the fairness and legitimacy of the impending election. One New York Times story was headlined, "Fear of Disorder Shadows Opposition Campaign." Another Times article asserted that controversy has raged about Sandinista campaign techniques and the Sandinistas' refusal to admit U.S. administration to delegation to monitor the vote. The story failed to note that hundreds of neutral foreign observers from all over the world were in the country, making the election the most closely monitored in history. As the voting began, the Times reported that persons in Contra-controlled regions were afraid to go to the polls because they feared Sandinista retaliation. Yet deeper into the story, we read that despite the anxiety, the turnout appeared high. The story offered no evidence that the Sandinistas had intimidated anyone. Having been promised to end the war and economic embargo if the U.S.-supported opposition party were elected, a battered population voted the Sandinistas out of power. U.S. press commentators and editorialists suddenly dropped their reservations about the election's legitimacy and hailed the result as in superlative terms. Without exception, the media referred to the 1990 contest as Nicaragua's first free election, thereby ignoring the 1984 election described above. The press never questioned the legitimacy of the U.S. government's injecting large sums into the contest to help to victory. On the contrary, such intervention was presented as a laudatory attempt to level the playing field, quote unquote. The news media recognized the U.S. policies that had undermined the Sandinistas' rule, but also this was also treated as a good thing. The FSLN defeat was ascribed to three causes in descending order of importance: Sandinista mismanagement of the economy, weariness with the 8-year Contra War, and resentment about military draft, the U.S. embargo. The United States was seldom linked to the Contra War, and the war was seldom treated as a cause of economic ruination. U.S. economic sanctions were extensive and brutally effective, but the American public had the opportunity to read only one or two words, embargoes or sanctions, to describe the terrible toll taken. Sandinista mismanagement, of which there was no doubt some, was seldom described in any concrete detail, but was repeatedly and unfairly blamed for the catastrophic attrition inflicted by the U.S. war and embargo. The Nicaraguan people did not vote out the Sandinista government. They voted an end to the U.S. campaign to destroy them. It was not a vote against Sandinista tyranny, but for Washington candidates. The hope was that the United States would then do what the Bush administration had repeatedly promised: lift the sanctions and stop the war. In no pre-election article did the U.S. press mention this influential factor. After the government took office, U.S. aid was used to speed up the free market, quote unquote, reconstruction of the economy in order to integrate it into the client state New World Order. Aid also went to right-wing political organizations and anti-Sandinista media and for school textbooks that taught traditional counter-revolutionary values. Meanwhile, the population suffered even greater economic calamity than during the war. The Bush administration, like its predecessor, was interested only in rolling back the Sandinista revolution. The people simply would have to endure the awful results. The White House was letting the other nations know what awaited them if they dared to move away from a client state status. The devil in Panama. In 1978, the United States and Panama signed a treaty to give the latter sovereignty over the Panama Canal by 1999. The canal had diminished in importance because of the technical advances in transportation, but the U.S. remained concerned about 14 military U.S. bases in Panama and Southern Command headquarters, and was the site for U.S. military and covert operations in Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition, Washington was uneasy about the Panamanian government under General Omar Torrijos. Unlike most Latin American military leaders, Torrijos was a populist reformist. He maintained friendly relations with the communist government of Cuba and used monies extracted from business and banks to fund social programs, some of which were beneficial to the people. In 1981, Torrijos was killed and his plane mysteriously blew up in midair. His place was taken by the head of the Panamanian military intelligence, Colonel Manuel Noriega. It is likely that Noriega, on the CIA payroll since 1967, engineered the crash that killed Torrijos. Noriega blunted much of the progressive character of the Torrijos administration. A Costa Rican legislative commission concluded that during the 1980s, Noriega had engaged in running guns to the Nicaraguan Contras and drugs to North America. He also collaborated with Oliver North in setting up corporate fronts to finance the Contras and an airfield in Costa Rica to supply them. Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking dated back to his days as head of Panamanian intelligence, and it was well known to U.S. leaders and the CIA. Noriega received $200,000 a year as a CIA agent, even when George Bush was the agency's director. Yet in the 1988 presidential campaign, Bush claimed he had known nothing about Noriega's narcotics activities. There were limits to Noriega's willingness to serve Washington. He reasserted Panama's independence with respect to control of the Canal Zone and the extension of leases on U.S. military bases. He reportedly refused to participate in an invasion against Nicaragua and apparently became less eager collaborator in espionage, U.S. espionage. Furthermore, he continued to maintain friendly relations with both Managua and Havana. Hostile reports about him began appearing in the United States. In 1987, the U.S. Justice Department indicted Noriega for drug smuggling. A crippling economic embargo was imposed upon Panama, causing unemployment to double in that country of 2 million inhabitants and social benefits to be cut drastically. Despite the tough U.S. sanctions and U.S. troop buildup in the Canal Zone, Noriega refused to step down from power as Washington demanded. In the U.S. press, our erstwhile and friendly Manuel Noriega was swiftly transformed from military leader to strongman dictator. A media blitz demonized the Panamanian leader as a drug dealer and prepared the American public for the ensuing invasion. During the aborted 1989 election in Panama, the U.S. press widely publicized the beating of an opposition candidate by Noriega's supporters. The press repeatedly referred to Noriega's goons and thugs. Never did it refer to both as goons in South Africa or Duarte's goons in El Salvador, or the various other thugs who practiced torture and murder in a host of U.S. client states. In mid-December 1989, just days before the U.S. invasion of Panama, ABC's Ted Koppel reported that Noriega had declared war on the United States. Other media announcers made the same unsupported assertion. In fact, Noriega, who was making peace officers at the very time to opposition leaders, was quoted in a Reuters dispatch as saying that the United States, through constant psychological and military harassment, has created a state of war in Panama. On December 20th, 1989, President Bush ordered U.S. forces to attack Panama. Television news, the media reaching the largest audience, provided coverage of Operation Just Cause that resembled a U.S. Army recruitment film. Helicopters landing, planes dive bombing, troops trotting along the foreign streets, and enemy headquarters engulfed in flames, friendly Panamanians welcoming the invaders as liberators. No TV reporter thought to point out that the Panamanians they interviewed were almost always well-dressed, light-skinned, and spoke English in a country where the majority were Spanish-speaking, dark-skinned, and black, and poor. Left out of the picture were the many incidents of armed resistance by the Panamanians. TV correspondents enthusiastically or matter-of-factly reported the heavy bombings of El Chorrillo and other working-class neighborhoods, treating these aerial attacks of civilian populations as surgical strikes designed to break resistance in what were considered Noriega's strongholds. While admitting that the heavily populated working-class districts supported Noriega, the press continued to assert that he was without popular support in his own country. As usual, the news media focused on operational questions. Was the invasion going well? Was there much resistance? And the most important question of all, how many American lives were lost? Questions of international law and the critical responses of other nations were pretty much ignored. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly condemned the U.S. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn the U.S. invasion, but this was given scant notice in the mainstream media. The Pentagon claimed only 3 U.S. troops were killed. Scores others were wounded or injured. No consideration was given by our government or media to the thousands of Panamanian soldiers and civilians killed, wounded, or in other ways harmed by the invasion. Nothing was said of the many thousands left homeless. After a studied silence, the White House came up with a figure of 516 Panamanian dead, claiming that most of these were military casualties. On this question, the press did little investigation of its own. The media decided there was no way verifying Panamanian losses, and no losses were reported. One television correspondent Fred Francis, was asked about civilian casualties. He said he did not know because he and other journalists in the Pentagon's pool were traveling with the U.S. Army. At the same time, problems of verification did not deter the media from offering fantastically inflated reports of about 80,000 to 100,000 demonstrators killed by the communist government in Romania. These figures, greater than the immediate Hiroshima death toll, should have been dismissed out of hand by any sane editor. Only months later did a few reports appear regarding mass graves and Panamanian dead buried hastily by U.S. Army bulldozers. The demonization of Manuel Noriega continued in full force during the invasion of his country, thereby reversing the roles of aggressor and victim. TV footage of him brandishing a machete at a rally was repeatedly run, projecting the image of a violent individual. CBS anchor Dan Rather referred to the Panamanian leader as a wily huge jungle snake and a swamp rat. And at the top of the list of the world's drug thieves and scums, the Ku Klux Klan Nazi Dan Rather, reporting Noriega as a swamp rat. ABC anchor Peter Jennings called Noriega one of the most odious creatures with whom the United States had a relationship. ABC Nightline Ted Koppel announced Noriega's reputation as a brutal drug-dealing bully who revealed in his public contempt for the United States all but begged the strong retribution. So all the Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American press describing Noriega with defamatory propaganda. The Pentagon reported the U.S. troops entering Noriega's headquarters, discovering a desk stuffed with pornography, a portrait of Hitler, voodoo paraphernalia, and 100 pounds of cocaine. Subsequent investigations found the pornography to be the Spanish-language copies of Playboy. The picture of Hitler was in a time-life photo history of World War II. The voodoo implements turned out to be San Bias Indian carvings, and the cocaine was nothing more than an emergency stockpile of tortilla flour. But these belated corrective revolution received scant coverage compared to the original hype. Supposedly, the United States had invaded Panama to bring a drug-crazed dictator to justice. But once Noriega was captured and jailed in Miami, U.S. military forces continued to occupy the country. U.S. authorities installed Panama's new democratic leaders, President Guillermo Endara, Vice President Guillermo Ford, and Attorney General Rogelio Cruz. Jonathan Marshall reported in Oakland Tribune that all three of these rich white oligarchs were closely linked to companies, banks, and individuals heavily invested in drug operations or the laundering of drug money. Marshall's revelations received little, if any, attention from the major media. With Noriega deposed and the U.S. military in firm control of Panama, conditions in that country deteriorated. Unemployment, already high because of the U.S. embargo, climbed to 35% as drastic layoffs were imposed on the public sector. Pension rights and other work benefits were lost. 8 radio stations, two television stations, and 2 newspapers were shut down by U.S. occupation authorities. A number of newspaper editors and reporters critical of the invasion were jailed or detained. Union heads were arrested by the U.S. military, and some 150 labor leaders were reminded of their elected positions within their unions. Public employees did not support the invasion were purged. Some 50 deposed officials from Noriega's government were still in jail as of late 1991, being held without charges or trial. Prisons built to accommodate 1,500 inmates held nearly 3 times that number under the occupation. Crime rates climbed dramatically after the invasion, along with poverty and destitution. Thousands remained homeless. Corruption was more widespread than ever. More money laundering and drug trafficking was going on under U.S.-sponsored Endara administration than under Noriega. These facts received little play in the U.S. mass media. A glimmer of truth peeked through now and then. Several years after branding Noriega the leading criminal of Central America, the New York Times observed that his alleged drug dealings were relatively small scale by American standards. American officials strongly support high-ranking military officers in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are similar, and in some cases even greater involvement in drug dealing, but yet have not taken sharp action against them. A Washington Post story about Panama's overcrowded prisons reported that none of Noriega's incarcerated associates had been brought to trial. The Post described this delay to inefficiency in the judicial system and not to the fact that there was little incriminating evidence against them. The story concluded, without benefit of any specifics, that human rights under the new regime had improved and press freedoms had been restored. That the news media hailed the accomplishment of did the news media hail the accomplishments of Operation Just Cause, celebrating the massacre of Iraq. For decades, U.S. officials and media commentators told us that the U.S. global military machine, with its 300 major bases around the world, was needed to protect us from a Moscow-directed Red Menace. But when the communist nations of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union dissolved into anti-communist pro-capitalist states, the U.S. global military machine did not dissolve along with them, but remained largely intact. U.S. leaders now maintain that the world was full of dangerous non-communist adversaries who apparently had been previously overlooked. Any foreign power, even a non-communist one, who tries to reclaim its own development at the expense of multinational corporate investors, risks feeling the crush of U.S. power. American political corporate elites have long been engaged in a struggle to make the world safe for capital accumulation, to retain control of the markets, raw materials, and cheap labor of poorer countries, and to prevent the emergence of revolutionary socialist, populist, or even nationalist military regimes that challenge this arrangement. For this, a global military machine is still needed. The goal is to create a world populated by client states, ones that leave themselves completely open to multinational corporate penetration on terms set by the penetrators. In early August 1990, Iraq, a national state under the rule of Saddam Hussein, invaded the Emirate of Kuwait after repeated disputes with that country over oil pricing and Kuwait border incursions, differences that Kuwait refused to negotiate. Shortly before the invasion, Hussein had received assurance from April Gillespie, the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, that the United States had no interest in Iraq's dispute with Kuwait. Similar assurances were made by U.S. officials at a House Foreign Affairs subcommittee and to the press. Soon after the invasion, however, President Bush called for United Nations economic sanctions against Baghdad. He sent U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia, contending that Hussein intended to invade that country also. Making no independent investigation, the U.S. news media uncritically transmitted the president's assertion to the American public. Bush also claimed our own freedom and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if all the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein. Again, most major news organizations unquestionably reported this scare story, failing to note that it was impossible for Hussein or any other Arab leader to monopolize all the world's great oil reserves. Little of the Gulf reserves came to the United States. American consumers were getting all the oil they wanted from other sources. Bush then claimed that Hussein planned to destroy Israel, another charge treated as established fact by the press. Hussein did eventually attack Israel with relatively ineffectual Scud missiles, but only in retaliation for the massive U.S. aerial attacks against Iraq. Bush's war policy did not prevent an attack on Israel. It incited one, a point the media consistently overlooked. Immediately after the public opinion poll showed that Americans reacted negatively to the idea of an Iraqi nuclear capability, the White House charged that Iraq was a nuclear threat. Again, the press obligingly went along, without raising any question as to why a nuclear-armed Iraq was more of a threat to the world than an already nuclear-armed China, Pakistan, Israel, or South Africa. Bush claimed he was upholding the United Nations commitment to defend its member states from aggression. A year before, when the UN voted 75-20 to condemn Bush's invasion of Panama as a flagrant violation of international law, NBC Evening News completely ignored the vote while CBS gave it all of 10 seconds. But now, without blushing, the press hailed George Bush as a defender of the UN Charter. The UN Security Council could act against Iraq as a collective peacekeeper for virtually the first time in history, claimed the United States. When the United States was repeatedly outvoted in the UN General Assembly on resolutions relating to nuclear first use, the nuclear freeze, the militarization of outer space, U.S. support for the Contra war in Nicaragua, U.S. support for Israeli aggression in Lebanon and the West Bank, and the U.S. invasions of Grenada and Panama, these developments received slight attention in the mainstream media. When the United Nations took positive positions critical of the White House line, the U.S. news media treated it as virtually invisible organization. When the United Nations went along with White House policy, as with the Gulf War, the media lavished attention on that organization. But no questions were raised in the U.S. media about why Iraq had to be ferociously attacked, while other aggressors went unpunished or were actually rewarded with U.S. aid. Thus, the White House never demanded the sanctions of military force used against Syria's invasion of Lebanon, Israel's invasion of Lebanon, Turkey's invasion of Cyprus, South Africa's invasion of Angola, and Indonesia's invasion of East Timor. And certainly no U.S. member state called for collective military action against the United States when it invaded Grenada and Panama, or when it waged covert actions, assaults on various other countries. UN collective security was something only the strong used against the weak. In August 1990, as already noted, Bush said that he was trying to prevent Hussein from grabbing all the oil's great oil reserves. But in October, he asserted that the fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression. The aggressor was Hussein, who the president now described as having done things worse than Hitler. No major media commentators questioned that characterization. Saddam was labeled as the butcher of Baghdad, madman, psychologically deformed, and a beast. The New York Times ran a David Levin cartoon across the top of its op-ed page, Descent of Man, showing in descending order a man, a gorilla, a monkey, a snake, and a distorted dwarfed Saddam Hussein. Times journalist Leslie Gebb dehumanized Hussein with an odd science fiction metaphor. If he were to survive war as a hero, he would be like a giant starship spitting undeflectable death rays. When the White House opted for a military attack against Iraq, the press once more fall into step. The network produced experts who told us that sanctions and negotiations, the latter attempted by Washington, would not dislodge Saddam. The New York Times ran a front page story, "Can sanctions work? Many aides are doubtful." Newsweek asserted it was impossible to negotiate with Hussein for the violations, all standards reasonable discourse, and rejected every rational approach. In short order, 24 of the 25 largest newspapers editorialized in favor of military force to liberate Kuwait and teach Saddam Hussein a lesson. By demonizing the Iraqis' leader, then equating him with the entire nation, the USA was able to wage a ferocious war against the Iraqi people, all the while pretending the attacks were against the wicked Hussein. NBC's Tom Brokaw asked, "Can the United States allow Saddam Hussein to live?" Cook Hokie Roberts said the smart thing to do was go after him and end this. Others talk of hurting, punishing, and taking him out. Meanwhile, Hussein was one of the few Iraqis during the war with a safe, warm place to sleep and plenty to eat and drink. Once the president began the all-out aerial war against Iraq, the U.S. news media transformed itself into a virtual cheering squad, identifying totally with U.S. forces, using "we," quote-unquote, to describe military actions. CBS's Walter Cronkite code, "We knocked one of the Scuds out of the sky." Others talked of the heavy damage we inflicted on Iraqi defenses. Telecasters interviewed U.S. Air Force pilots who told how good it felt to drop bombs on Iraqi cities. "This was tremendous. Baghdad was lit up like a Christmas tree," gushed one pilot on NBC. "It's exciting. It's the same adrenaline that a hunter has on the hunt," enthused another on NBC. One NBC correspondent noted admiringly that pilots were cool under pressure, and CNN telecaster affirmed, "We have been hearing nothing but good comments from the pilots." After the first night of aerial attacks, CBS correspondent remarked, anchor Dan Rather, "So far things look good." On that same show, Rather mentioned that the FBI was visiting hundreds of Arab Americans to investigate possible links to terrorist organizations. Far from seeing anything wrong with equating Arab with terrorist, Rather exulted, "The FBI has done a terrific job to defend us against terrorists." With an enthusiasm befitting Dr. Strangleglove, journalists celebrated the use of high-tech weaponry in the systematic destruction of a small third-world nation. CBS correspondent Charles Osgood exclaimed that the bombing in Iraq was a marvel. CBS's Jim Stewart praised 2 days of almost picture-perfect assault. ABC anchor Peter Jennings extolled the brilliance of laser-guided bombs. But the next evening, he labeled an Iraqi missile a horrifying killer. On the NBC affiliate station in Washington, D.C., announcer Jim Vance commented, "We can be proud of our men and women who are heroically and with devastating efficiency serving our country." While there was nothing in the press but praise for the military, Jim Lehrer of PBS McNeil Lehrer NewsHour wondered if the media were doing their job. He has been publicly adequately prepared for this war by the press. Has the public been adequately prepared for the war by the press and officials? No question was raised as to why independent news organizations had to prepare, quote unquote, for public official policy. Such coordinated efforts between the press and the state in communist countries are usually denounced as totalitarian. War coverage was rightly controlled by the military limited to rotating pools of accredited reporters closely monitored by a military attaché. The major media accepted this censorship with few complaints. NBC anchor Tom Brokaw was downright sympathetic. Officers remember Vietnam, and in fairness to them, some got burned. So understandably, they didn't want the press to cause the same damage again. New York Times managing editor Joseph Liefeld was equally commenting, the First Amendment gives the right to publish just about anything. It does not give us the right to go just about anywhere. Thus, he ignored both ordinary logic and the body of constitutional law that say the right to publish is closely connected with the right to have access to newsworthy locations and sources. It remained for small dissident media like The Nation, The Guardian, Harper's, and Pacific Radio News to sue the government, claiming that the military censorship violated the First Amendment. The mainstream press not only refused to join the suit, it gave the case scant coverage. The worst censorship came not from military but from press itself in its one-sided and ideologically loaded coverage and commentary. News organizations punished the few who deviated from the official line. As noted in an earlier chapter, NBC President Michael Gardner suppressed footage on the destruction of Basra and made John Alpert, a 12-year stringer who shot the film, from ever working the network again. A San Francisco columnist Warren Hinkle was suspended for 3 months for being too critical of Bush's war. Several radio talk show hosts and local newspaper editors were fired or forced to resign because of criticism they raised by the war. The media played down the human costs of the war. There were continual replays of on-target bombings, but no replays of the many missiles that missed their targets. The military emphasized the precise surgical nature of the aerial and artillery strikes. Indeed, the attacks were surgical in that they systematically destroyed the industrial life support systems and security of Iraqi society. However, over 90% of the bombings involved free-falling gravity bombs that hit anything standing or moving, with a total of 85,000 tons of explosive, the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima atomic bombs. The great superpower used its tremendous technological might to pound a small nation into submission, and the media gave the event a positive framing. Here was the clean war with no visible casualties. A Newsweek cover headline actually read, "A New Science of War, High-Tech Hardware, How Many Lives Can It Save?" Few Iraqi dead and no American dead were shown on television or newspaper photos. Tens of thousands of retreating Iraqis were massacred by Allied bombs, but news pictures showed only wrecked vehicles. When representatives of several dissident publications went to the major photo services for more graphic shots, there were none to be found. The clerks had been instructed to destroy any photographs showing dead bodies. At no time during the war did the major media estimate the number of Iraqis killed. As with Vietnam, Grenada, and Panama, only American lives counted. NBC commentator John Sanchler concluded, "The most important thing to be said about the war is that there were very few casualties." But the London Sunday Times quoted senior Pentagon officials who concluded that as many as 200,000 Iraqis may have died in the Gulf War. The report was ignored by the U.S. media. Iraqi losses were briefly revealed when the CNN's Peter Arnett produced footage from the Baghdad of hundreds of deaths caused by U.S. aerial destruction of a civilian bomb shelter. But the mainstream media quickly dismissed the incident. NBC Trump Brokaw was insistent, "We must point out again and again that it is Saddam who put these innocents in harm's way." CBS correspondent Ron Allen shrugged it off. Iraq is trying to gain sympathy. After giving us a brief glimpse of Baghdad's casualties, McNeil Lehrer, commentator, dismissed them as heavy-handed manipulation. CBS Mark Phillison toned, "Saddam Hussein promised a bloody war, and here is the blood." U.S. forces consistently violated the Geneva Conventions in their unrestrained aerial attacks on civilian populations, on fleet troops, and on facilities necessary to sustain civilian life, such as hydroelectric systems, water treatment plants, residential neighborhoods, and the like. The media never correctly labeled these attacks as war crimes, preferring to gloss over them with military euphemisms like surgical strikes, collateral damage, and target-rich environments. If there were war crimes, the press would have us believe they were committed exclusively by Iraq. One of the media's favorite propaganda horror stories of Iraq soldiers pillaging Kuwaiti hospitals and tossing 312 babies from incubators. The Washington Post carried references to this fantasy some 10 times during the Gulf crisis. Only after the war ended did a few newspapers passingly acknowledge that the atrocities never happened. Buried on an inside page of the Post, in the middle of a long article, was one sentence quote from a Kuwaiti doctor indicating that the incubator story was false. The Times offered a hedging two-sentence retraction toward the end of a long article. Some of the atrocities that had been reported, such as the killing of infants in the main hospital shortly after the invasion, are untrue or have been exaggerated, the Kuwaiti said. Of these various television networks, only ABC briefly acknowledged the falsity of the incubator atrocity. So give me 1 second. Glad you could join us today. Okay. Okay, so let's continue. U.S. pilots were viciously beaten and tortured while prisoners of war, or so the news media had many of us believing. Pictures of captured pilots whose faces showed signs of bruises and cuts were repeatedly run in the broadcast and print media. Torture and torment, how will the captives fare under Iraq's brutal treatment, is how Newsweek headlined the cover story. We were reportedly reminded that such mistreatment was a war crime. Thus were the roles of victim and victimizer reversed. The pilots, when perpetrated criminal acts by raining death and destruction upon civilian populations, were themselves depicted as victims of war crimes. In rare instances, traces of the truth could be found, as in the passing comments buried in a Washington Post story. There were no indications that any U.S. captives had been tortured, and the Red Cross observed all prisoners in rather good shape. The media began reporting some of the human costs after the war was over, and only when Hussein could be designated the culprit. Saturation coverage was given to the plight of fleeing Kurds stranded on mountainsides. New York Times columnist Leslie Gelb wrote about Iraqi forces slaughtering Kurds and Shiites, as NBC's John Chancellor charged that Hussein was slaughtering his own people. Neither Gelb nor Chancellor nor any other major commentator had used slaughter to describe the far more ferocious war waged by President Bush against the Iraqi people. Well after the war was over, the dying continued. A United Nations mission reported that living conditions in Iraq were at a crisis level. Nothing that we had seen or read had quite prepared us for the particular form of devastation which has now befallen the country. The recent conflict has wrought near apocalyptic results on the economic infrastructure of what had been, until January 1991, a rather urbanized, highly mechanized society. Most means of modern life support have been destroyed or rendered tenuous. Iraq has for some time to come been relegated to a pre-industrial age, but with all the disabilities of post-industrial dependency on an intensive use of technology and energy. The report went on to describe the horrendous conditions of hunger, disease, and death. The sensational findings received slight attention, if any, in the U.S. press. The United Nations once more became an invisible organization. After a trip to Iraq, a Harvard study team reported in June 1991, without electricity, water cannot be purified, sewage cannot be treated, waterborne diseases flourish in hospitals, cannot cure treatable illness. Therefore, the increased incidence of mortality, morbidity, and the deterioration of the medical system are linked to the destruction of Iraq's electrical power in the Gulf War. This finding, too, was largely ignored by the media. ABC and the Washington Post briefly reported the cholera threatened in Iraq, but little explicit mention was made about the health crisis. Richard Haas, as special president assistant to George Bush, noted that during the Gulf War, television was our chief tool in selling our policy at home and abroad. Indeed, the White House and the Pentagon should have paid the mainstream press for the way it reported the crisis. The press have given almost no attention to what critics said were the real lessons for the war: to protect the interests and profits of the oil cartels, to beat another third world nation into economic submission, to boost the military budget, and obliterate talk of, quote, peace dividends, to drive up savings and loan scandal off the evening news, and to bolster President Bush's image as a bold and courageous leader. Lacking critical information and argument to the contrary, the press rallied around troops and treated the war as a just undertaking. Vietnam, Grenada, Nicaragua, Panama, Iraq. Whenever leaders chose to make war, the press joins up. In 1923, referring to an early war, British journalist Phillips Gibbs wrote, "We identified absolutely with the armies in the field. There was no need of censorship of our dispatches. We were our own censors." So that's it. That's the 2 chapters. Let's get started. Let's review the Third World during the Third World. This is the insult session. The Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government and their mass media. We are discussing them at length today. So basically, suppressive military forces financed, trained, equipped, and assisted by the United States. Their function being not to protect the populace from foreign invasion, but to protect the small, wealthy owning class and foreign investors from the populace. So that's what the goal is. The goal is to protect the government and the moneyed interest, the foreign capital from the people, because they are racist, white, sick scoundrels, and that is what it is. The population, aside from the small middle class, endure impoverishment, high illiteracy rates, malnutrition, wretched housing, and non-existent human services. This is all the Third World: Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They're all similar in the way the U.S. does it. High literacy rates, malnutrition, wretched housing, and non-existent human services, because they're anti-third world, anti-ethnic, white, Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States. That's why these are the results of their, approach. Because of the widespread poverty, these nations have been mistakenly designated as underdeveloped and poor, when in fact they are overexploited and the source of great wealth, their resources of cheap labor, serving to enrich investors. Only their people remain poor. So remember that. U.S. intervention in the Third World keeps the people with malnutrition, high illiteracy, wretched housing, and non-existent medical and human services. That is because they are a Ku Klux Klan Nazi government, an anti-ethnic, racist group of whites. So continuing on, the purpose of U.S. policy has not been to defend democracy. In fact, democracies as in Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, Indonesia, 1965, and Chile, 1973, are regularly overthrown if they attempt to initiate serious reforms that tamper with existing class structure. So if you tamper with the existing class structure, you are overthrown. The U.S. government uses its military to, be a mafia thug, a group of Ku Klux Klan Nazis. Okay, in all this, the U.S. corporate-owned news media have been intentionally or not actively complicit. As one critic of the press observed, it is a truism that in U.S. foreign reporting, the State Department often makes the story, to which we might add, when not the State Department itself, the CIA, Pentagon, or White House. So U.S. corporate news media, it means the State Department makes the story about the wars, the overthrows of governments, the regime changes, the endless number of regime changes by the Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American government. They make the story. The Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department make the story. The CIA often make the story. In fact, the CIA has editors on the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all the major news outlets. So that is, a given. The Vietnam apology. So from 1945 to 54, the United States spent several $billion supporting a ruthless French colonialism in Vietnam, but the American public was never informed of this. So 8 years, the U.S. supported plantation slavery for the ethnic Asians of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Plantation slavery was the French colonialism. Just like the Southern blacks, the U.S. government supported this system of racist oppression against the people of Vietnam. They are a Ku Klux Klan group of Nazis. That is what we say. In the following decade, Washington assumed full responsibility for the maintenance of the South Vietnamese right-wing dictatorship, but the public neither read nor heard a word of debate in the media about this major policy commitment. Okay, then reporters who covered the Vietnam War were expected to get on the team to share the military's view of the war and its progress, and most of them did. The press, with few exceptions, censored the worst of the war, saying almost nothing about the massive saturation bombings of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the free fire zones, U.S.-sponsored torture, the Phoenix Death Squad programs, the massive destruction of Indochinese rural life, the indiscriminate killing of the civilian population, and the dumping of 12 million tons of Agent Orange and other toxic chemicals on the countryside, the effects of which are still being felt in Vietnam in the form of premature deaths, deformed babies, and abnormally high cancer rates. That is what the Ku Klux Klan Nazis do. They are sick butchers, sick white racist butchers, to drop to 12 million tons of Agent Orange, to do saturation bombings in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Phoenix Death Squad program, that is the American enforced disappearance program. They grab you off the street and they mutilate you. That is the American government. Look no further than your own backyard if you were an American. Look no further than your own government. Your Ku Klux Klan Nazis did this to the Vietnamese people. And that is what they should understand. The massive destruction of Indochinese life, indiscriminate killing of the civilian population, these are all actions. No newspaper in the United States would publish the articles she wrote, documented the death and destruction wreaked upon Vietnamese peasantry. Eventually, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran the two mildest ones. Gellhorn, Martha Gellhorn, finally a veteran war correspondent, started to talk about the casualties. Nobody would print it. She had to go to Great Britain to get her views published. And then the U.S. government revoked her visa to Vietnam. That is what ultimately it is. You give truth, the U.S. revokes your visa. They are a Ku Klux Klan fascist dictatorship. That is what the United States are. They are fascist Ku Klux Klan, Nazis. Okay, so when Nicholas Tomlin gave the Washington Post his graphic account of how U.S. troops gunned down Vietnamese from helicopter gunships, the newspaper refused to run the story. Okay, President Johnson, the Time rewrote the news from Vietnam. She witnessed how the Time magazine rewrote news from Vietnam because of weekly phone calls President Lyndon Johnson would make to Otto Furbinger, urging him to call his own reporters in the field liars. Some of the best reporters and writers Time had in those days quit over these distortions. So President Johnson was printing the news for the Time magazine. That is why it is just, fabrication. It is a propaganda show of the U.S. government. It's a Ku Klux Klan fascist journalism is what American media is. The My Lai massacre, over 100 unarmed Vietnamese women, children, and elderly men by U.S. troops was not published for over a year after it happened, and then by a small independent news service. In fact, a systematic obliteration of villages described as pacification, quote unquote, was a commonplace occurrence and an unconscious U.S. counterinsurgency goal. So massive civilian, women, children, and elderly men, murder was commonplace. It's called pacification. The murder of Vietnamese civilians on a much larger scale than My Lai was documented by two Newsweek correspondents in 1971. Newsweek refused to print their story for 6 months and would not release it for freelance submission to other publications. In 1972, the magazine finally ran a heavily cut version of the story. When the reporters asked to do a follow-up, they were turned down. So that's, basically cut the story, and censor the media. Criticism here is that they failed to report honestly. Could argue that the news media job was not to judge or denounce the war, but to report it. But the criticism is they were dishonest. They are liars. It is a liar press of whites. The execution of Vietnamese resistance fighters by an unarmed, trained South Vietnamese military officer, a naked Vietnamese girl running down a road in Terrapin after being napalmed. They had pictures of this. They had, atrocities never discussed. But the essence of the war, magnitude, death, destruction, and atrocity was never shown. So that's ultimately what that is. U.S. intervention in Vietnam, declared Richard Stout in the New Republic, was not wickedness, it was stupidity, one of the greatest blunders of our history. So you didn't talk about the actual, the fact that they were racist war of aggression against the ethnic Vietnamese. This was a Ku Klux Klan invasion by the racist white scoundrels of the American government. But we said that it was because we were stupid. We were well-intentioned. How is plantation slavery against ethnic Vietnamese people well-intentioned? It is a group of Ku Klux Klan racists, Confederate Southern racists, seething angry whites is what it is. It is not, well-intentioned anything. assisted by academic and officials, the national media rewrote the history of the war, asserting that the United States had selflessly intervened to try to install a Western-style democracy. That is just fraud. That is fraud. This is a Ku Klux Klan plantation slavery oppression by the U.S. government scoundrels. The country was reportedly impoverished because of the economic failure and not because of the massive destruction of capital resources by U.S. forces. After the news of the war, they constantly blamed the Vietnamese. They didn't worry about the fact that the major media suppressed, little if anything appeared in the major media. It suppressed tens of thousands of Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, tens of thousands of Vietnamese amputees and other permanently crippled and disabled by U.S. firepower, 100,000 Vietnamese drug addicts hooked by the same suppliers who serviced the invading troops, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese prostitutes, petty criminals, mentally disturbed persons, and other victims of the war. So this is what the U.S. does. They create amputees. They create, deformed people, give them cancer with Agent Orange. This is the American technology that you can expect if you're a third world. The U.S. government is a danger group of Ku Klux Klan Nazis. That is what this is. Amputations, permanent cripples, the creation of hundreds of thousands of prostitutes, petty criminals, mentally disturbed persons, and other victims of the war. So prostitution, that is the U.S. government. Third world women, you're looking to be prostitutes. If you back the United States in anything, it is that you will be a prostitute of the white scoundrels of Washington. Remember that. America is a Ku Klux Klan Nazi group. It's not what it seems. It's a guy dressed in a nice suit, but with a Ku Klux Klan white robe on his head, ready to turn you into a prostitute if you're a woman, or a drug addict if you are a man. Remember that America is a dangerous government of white thugs. Okay, so finally, murder in Chile. Let's talk about Chile. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile and began initiating reforms. That country suddenly became the hottest news story in Latin America. From the beginning, the U.S. press saw the Democratic elected government as an ominous threat to democracy. ABC's Howard Smith observed that the new Marxist government had outright communist internal policies, but the New York Times and the Washington Post pondered whether Chile's free institutions could survive what the Times described as a sharp turn to the left. And Los Angeles Times editorial discerned totalitarian inclinations in Chile. So Salvador Allende was a totalitarianist. That's ultimately what it is. President Allende presided over the country whose citizens enjoyed a wide range of civil liberties, freedom of public organizations, and even ultra-right ones. The U.S. press questioned the legitimacy of Allende's mandate by repeatedly reminding its audiences that he was a minority president, having won only 37% plurality. What exactly was Allende doing to deserve such a bad press? He was moving toward an egalitarian socialist society, having begun by nationalizing the copper mines owned by U.S. multinational corporations, and under a statute passed in 1967 by his conservative Chilean Congress, which largely left unimplemented. His government was taking unused land from big estates and distributing it to landless peasants. During Allende's first year, the economy enjoyed an 8.5% growth in GNP, the second highest in Latin America. So basically that's what Allende was doing. He was doing great things for the Chilean people. America would not have it. They are Ku Klux Klan scoundrel whites. They would not have Chile's democracy and Chile's progress. The United States eagerly assisted in the campaign to make the economy scream. President Nixon, by cutting off food aid, denying Chile any new lanes, and cutting exports to Chile by 40% and imports from that country by almost half. Only of the Chilean military flourished, being the recipient of $47 million in aid. So that's what President Nixon did. That's what the U.S. government did. It waged an economic war against Allende to change the democracy from democracy to a military fascist dictatorship. They are Ku Klux Klan fascists of the American government, and that's what they did to the poor Chilean people. Dr. Allende and his Popular Unity Coalition dominated the socialist and communist parties, attempted to socialize Chile. The government met stiff opposition from the upper and middle class, and the armed forces, traditionally non-political, finally sided with the regime's opponents. This is an article in the New York Times. Okay, this is all fraud. Okay, Allende was overthrown by the United States government, foreign intervention. The racist scoundrels of the United States overthrew Allende with a military, murder type thing. The few sentences carry a bundle of deception. The socialist and communist parties who supposedly dominated the government were duly elected by the Chilean people and adhered strictly to constitutional procedures. They attempted to socialize Chile, but the Times did not explain what that phrase meant, what the government actually did, what the programs that started the people. Okay, so socializing Chile, basically the armed forces nor did the armed forces finally side with the regime's opponents after much scrupulous neutrality. Far from being non-political, they plotted and conspired from the first months Allende took power, purging their ranks, aiding the efforts of right-wing terrorism, and disarming the few on the left who had guns. That's the American government. They arm the right-wing terrorists. For the destruction of Chilean democracy, the U.S. press tended to blame the victims themselves. Thus, in an editorial immediately after the coup, the New York Times noted, "No Chilean party or faction can escape some responsibility for the disaster, but a heavy share must be assigned to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself. Even when the dangers of polarization had become unmistakably evident, he persisted in pushing a program of pervasive socialism for which he had no popular mandate." All lies. The U.S. government overthrew Allende for the sake of a fascist dictatorship so that they could oppress the people of Chile. They could turn them into oxen. That is what the U.S. government does. They are dangerous Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American government. They put the Chilean people in the state of oxen without money. They had hundreds and thousands of poor people, poor children walking the streets. That is what will happen if you let the United States into your democracy. You will end up with, murder, torture, and rape by the white scoundrels, the Ku Klux Klan Nazis of America. The leading U.S. newspapers took pains to report there was no evidence of U.S. involvement in the destruction of Chile. To reach this conclusion, they also had to ignore the economic war waged by Washington and the CIA's funding of opposition right-wing political parties and media in Chile. General Augusto Pinochet, nor his government was ever described as fascist, which they were by any established news organizations in the United States. So Allende was described as a Marxist, but Pinochet was never described as a fascist. He was a fascist right-wing murderer. Okay, in contrast, the Times described Allende's executioner. Allende was murdered by the U.S. government. He was murdered by the generals. Allende, and they lied about it. They covered that up too. The white scoundrels of America pretend that he was, he killed himself. In contrast, the Times described Allende's executioner, General Pinochet, as a powerfully built 6-footer. So Allende killed himself with a suicide, is what the U.S. government says. They are racist scoundrel whites, liar, racist, mentally deranged white Ku Klux Klan Nazis, is what the American government is. Okay, they described but Pinochet as a built 6-footer. Certainly he was a mass murder that we could all warm up to. Energetic and very disciplined Pinochet, the mass murder Pinochet. So the tortures delivered by Pinochet's victims included applications of electric shock to different parts of the body, particularly genitals, forcing victims to witness the torture of friends and relatives, raping women in the presence of other family members, burning sexual organs with acid or scalding water, placing infected rats into the vagina, mutilating, puncturing, or cutting off various parts of the body, including genitalia, eyes, and tongue, injection of air into women's breasts and veins, causing slow, painful death, shoving bayonets and clubs into the vagina and anus, causing rupture and death. So this is what they'll do to the mestizos of Latin America and the Hispanics of Latin America and the blacks. They will put vaginas into your put rats into your vagina with infections. They will put, bayonets into your vagina and anus. That is what the whites of Washington are up to. They are sick scoundrels. This is what they did. This is Pinochet. They trained Pinochet. They trained Pinochet how to torture the people. The American government does this. They are torture monsters. It is the maximum torture. The highest enforced disappearances, look only in your backyard, Washington, D.C. The higher torture of third world people, look only in your backyard, Washington, D.C. They're racist Ku Klux Klan Nazi government of the United States. Okay, then we talked about the Pinochet regime. Chile's regime sees no economic hope. Okay, they talked about a prison that shows that Pinochet is doing well. Just all lies. They just lied and made up stuff. For years, Shirley Christian of the Miami Herald, described how Pinochet was adored by his subjects, how he had rescued Chile's economy from Marxist ruination, how he's like an iron-willed father pounding the head of the table, and how he's tough and in charge. He speaks his mind, peace, tranquility. Order, Pinochet has brought Chile these things. He was a tyrant. He was a mass murderer. He was a torturer. And she is a Ku Klux Klan, woman's representative. Shirley Christian is a Ku Klux Klan Nazi representative of the American press. She is talking about, something delusional in her mind. Pinochet is a mass murderer and a rapist and a torturer. And she's calling him good person. That is what the Americans do. They look at his face and they say he's good. They are racist white scoundrels. Ku Klux Klan Nazi American government. 68 years, belied by his boxer's fatigue, matched by a trim gray mustache. Okay, they described Pinochet by these words. Instead, they described Salvador Allende Gossens, a Marxist, died inside. Allende was murdered. They said he died inside. He was murdered by the U.S. government. They are Ku Klux Klan Nazi murderers, Ku Klux Klan murderers. In fact, Pinochet's policies brought a drastic drop in real wages, an upward redistribution of income to the benefits of the rich, a sharp growth in unemployment, and a huge increase in foreign debt, a falling savings, massive corruption, and racketeering by the military, and heartless cutbacks for the poor. That's what you'll get. That's what the U.S. does. They, cut the poor people. Hence, here the New York Times endorsed the dictatorship over democracy as the means to creating economic success. So that's what it is. That's Chile. Let's talk about Grenada. 1983, when the U.S. government invaded the tiny and relatively defenseless sovereign nation of Grenada in an unprovoked assault and in blatant violation of international law, killing scores on the island of occupants and defenders, the American press pretty much went along with it. To be sure, there were editorials in papers like the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times denouncing the invasion. But, for the most part, the invasion was hailed. Deliberate distortions and knowingly false statements were made by the Reagan administration. Correspondents like Jack Smith at ABC News and commentators like Bill Moyers of CBS positively aligned themselves with the aggression, seeing it as a necessary mission to restore democracy. They again put a fascist dictator in Grenada. Reagan attacked the blacks of Grenada. It was a racist war of aggression, a racist Ku Klux Klan war of the Nazi American Ku Klux Klan government that attacked Grenada. Rescuing Grenada. Ignored were the medical students who testified that they were never threatened by the Grenadians nor the Cubans, nor prevented from leaving the island. So they said medical students, it was untrue. The press accorded generous exposure to the official view that Grenada was a Cuban military bastion. Grenada's defendants were Cuban, extremely well-armed, reported Newsweek. Only a handful were military personnel, the rest being construction workers, medical personnel, and diplomatic personnel. Only 784 Cubans were found. The Reagan administration, the Times, and Newsweek reported 1,500 Cuban troops. All lies, just open lies by the U.S. mass media. Reagan administration announced the invasion was not merely a rescue operation for students, but for the entire Caribbean. The U.S. press went along with the revised and expanded version. So Reagan just kind of makes versions of what reason he's doing, and the U.S. press just, okay, version 2 is fine. Version 3 of why we're murdering people in Grenada is fine. It's all fine. They are Ku Klux Klan racist Nazis. That's what it is. Eventually, when journalists were allowed to visit the island, some sent back reports indicating that the arms cache actually consisted mostly of small arms, enough to equip an army of about 2,000. Reagan said there were 8,000 to 10,000 terrorists were being armed by Grenada, by Cuba. They found about 2,000 arms. They wouldn't take over the Caribbean. It was all lies. Okay, so Washington believed that the tiny Caribbean country was being redesigned from a tourist haven to a communist airbase and a way station and a stopping point for Cuban soldiers on their way to Africa for East Bloc supplies and on their way to Nicaragua. So he presented a hallucination. Reagan was a delusional, mentally sick racist. Okay, he had a hallucination that somehow Grenada was becoming a support for Cuba and Nicaragua. All lies. He's delusional, hallucinatory, mentally sick white is what Reagan was. Okay, Cuban help with investments from a number of Western capitalist countries, including Great Britain. Okay, so it was Cuban help that was putting the airport together. They couldn't accept it. Okay, the new jewel, the experiments in grassroots economic democracy was the hallmark of New Jewel's government of Maurice Bishop's. They overthrew him. Basically they were making free education, increasing literacy, cultural and sports programs, equal pay, equal legal status, all these things the U.S. government would not have. The mentally sick whites of Washington, the racist Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American government would not allow development in Grenada. He had agrarian reform and cash crop exports. We can talk about hundreds of third world incursions, Cuba, Zaire, Guatemala, El Salvador. The list goes on and on and on. What becomes apparent in the cases already presented are the patterns of omission and distortion, specifically the way the news media leave unexamined the premises and self-serving claims of U.S. foreign policy and accept the White House perspective at face value, confining critical commentary to operational matters, downplay, ignore U.S. sponsorship of reactionary repression and the repression itself, suppress descriptions of the content of third world struggles for national independence, economic justice, and voluntary change, reduce third world struggles to an encounter between a virtuous United States and demonic adversaries, and I will discuss these in the next chapter. So that's the U.S., approach. It sponsor reactionary repression, murder of people, torture of people for the New World Order. This chapter offers several more case studies. The press does its part to sanitize the U.S. force and violence against countries that adopt the course not in keeping with the interest of global U.S. hegemony. So we talked about Nicaragua, made safe for landowners and American investors by the American government. They put Somoza in power. He was a mass murderer. He was a butcher of Managua, but they kept him in power for so many years. It was all fine. The Somoza family owned 23%. The landowners owned 58% of variable land. 5% of the population owns 58% of the land. That's democracy. That is why they are Ku Klux Klan Nazis, is what it is. 50,000 people were killed, mostly by Somoza's forces. 160,000 were wounded or maimed. 40,000 children were orphaned out of a population of 2 million. This is what Somoza's war did to in 1979 to the Nicaraguan people. The FSLN, who finally overthrew the dictatorship, hundreds and thousands of dead bodies. That is what America does to Hispanics as well as mestizos and Indians. Remember, Indians, they hate the Indians. Nicaragua has a lot of Indians. They are racist, Ku Klux Klan, Nazi, anti-Indian, scoundrel whites. And that is what we say. So continue on. Staples food consumption. After, 5 years of Sandinista rule, in 1984, infant mortality dropped, unemployment declined, inflation reduced, national health care increased 600%, staple food increase, rural free clinics, hospitals, and vaccination, 50% drop in malaria, medical services, improved diet, dramatic decrease in children's diseases. Washington would have none of this stuff. The Reagan administration cut off all aid and trade to Nicaragua, imposing a crippling economic embargo on that country. U.S. forces mined Nicaraguan harbors, blew up its oil depots, and openly armed, trained, and financed mercenary army of Contras. 1984, Managua charged that Washington was pursuing a policy of aggression against Nicaragua and that was planning an invasion. ABC News dismissed this as Sandinista paranoia. Okay, first they claimed that they were intervening in Nicaragua to interdict Sandinista weapons supposedly being sent to Salvadoran rebels, even though the arms were flowing the other way from El Salvador to the U.S.-supported Contras. So they reversed all of it. They reversed the roles of what the Contras were doing, what the Nicaraguans were doing. They're just Ku Klux Klan Nazi racists, okay? They are butchers. Okay, so continuing on. So voting aspects, okay? So the election in 1984, it was all, determined to be fair. The U.S. denounced it, the U.S. press. Whenever they don't get the result, they denounce it. They start shouting because they are, fascist whites. They are a fascist government of whites, and their fascist media denounce elections that are fair. So Sandinistas may win big in the elections, but against whom? Or going through motions in Nicaragua. The Democratic efforts to say that the election was going to be fair, they said all lies. It was all lies. The Sandinistas won the 1984 election with almost 65% of votes. Two conservative parties gleaned 13% and 9% respectively. Okay, so they wouldn't allow it. It was a fair election. It was allow it. The New York Times was unhappy with the result, so they made their anger known. They're a fascist government and media. National Endowment for Democracy. La Prensa was closed. They made a big deal of La Prensa closing. It was a right-wing journal of the U.S. government. They can close it, but they wouldn't. They focused on it. The U.S. government closed all the newspapers in El Salvador, but that was okay because they are fascist, white, violent Ku Klux Klan thugs. Okay, the story failed to note that hundreds of neutral foreign observers all over the world were in the country making the election the most closely monitored in history. So basically, they already distorted the election in 1990. You were already ready to denounce the election, but then finally they won. Okay, the U.S. press commentators and editors suddenly dropped their reservations about the elections. British observers said it was fine, but the United States press still said it was unfair. That is what they are. They are fascist liars is what it is. So the news media recognized that U.S. policy had undermined the Sandinistas' rule, but this was also treated as a good thing. The Nicaraguan people did not vote out the Sandinistas. They did not vote out a Sandinista tyranny, but they voted for Washington's candidate because they're waging a murderous war against the population of Nicaragua. Aid also went to right-wing political organizations. Bush said he was going to do good things. He created a misery for the Nicaraguan people. They had greater economic calamity than during when the Contras were there. A devil in Panama. Let's talk about it. He maintained Noriega, General Torrijos, populist leader. He was, basically funding social programs. He was assassinated by the CIA. Okay, so Noriega came to power. He wanted to serve Washington. Basically he changed to a nationalist. He wanted to get the United States out of Panama, and he became a nationalist. He stopped attacking Nicaragua. He stopped funding the Contras, and so the U.S. got angry. In the U.S. press, Roosevelt funded Manuel Noriega was swiftly transformed from military leader to strongman dictator. Noriega, basically the U.S. press demonized Noriega. They called him a goon and thugs. They never called South Africa both as a goon or thugs. This is what the U.S. press did. Panamanians they interviewed were almost always well-dressed, light-skinned, and spoke English in a country where the majority were Spanish-speaking, dark-skinned, and poor. So they're white, light-skinned, and white, so they're fine. That's the way it is. They were hailing the invasion. It was a fraud. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn the U.S. invasion, but this was given scant notice in the press. So if the UN says you're a group of racist Ku Klux Klan scoundrels, they ignore it. But when they support it, it's fine. Okay, the Pentagon claimed that only 23 U.S. troops were killed, scores other wounded. All lies. Okay, so we talked about 80,000 to 100,000 demonstrators killed by communists. All a lie, but they supported that number. It was more than what was killed in Hiroshima. The demonization of Manuel Noriega continued in full force. We talked about Don Rather, the Panamanian leader, as a wily jungle snake and swamp rat. And at the top of the list, the world's drug thieves and scums. He's a fascist Ku Klux Klan mafia journalist, Dan Rather. Same as Peter Jennings, one of the more odious creatures to whom the United States has had a relationship. Ted Koppel, Noriega's reputation as a brutal drug-dealing bully, revealed in his public, begged the U.S. for distribution. These are Ku Klux Klan scoundrel whites of the U.S. press. Okay, they talked about, we talked about all of the things. Okay, so President Guillermo Andara, Vice President Guillermo Ferd, Attorney General Julia Cruz, Jonathan Marshall, Oakland Tribune, rich oligarchs, banks, and heavily involved in the drug trade. Okay, so this is what they put into power. Drug terrorists. Andara, Ford, and Cruz. They were drug terrorists, and that's who Bush put into power. Okay, when Noriega was deposed and the U.S. military firmly controlled, conditions in that country deteriorated. Huge unemployment. They closed newspapers. The standard thing, create a fascist government, cut the external review, and then you murder the people. 50 deposed people were in jail without charges at trial. Prisons were not, good enough. It was a corruption, a huge corruption. Branding, okay, and then they retracted it. Quite at the end, they retract that he's not a drug terrorist. That's what it is. He's not a drug terrorist. He's a normal person, but it doesn't matter because now he's in jail and you can't do anything. They are Ku Klux Klan, fascist, mafia, American press. Okay, the Washington Post, overcrowded prisons. Okay, they couldn't bring the Noriega's associates to trial. They had no evidence against them, but they kept them in prison. That's the American government. They're fascist scoundrels. So the massacre of Iraq, huge things, client states, completely open, world populated to multinational corporations. Iraq, a nationalist state under the rule of Saddam Hussein, invaded the Emirate of Kuwait, and after repeated disputes with that country over oil pricing and Kuwaiti border incursions, differences that Kuwait refused to negotiate. Shortly before the invasion, Hussein assured assurances from April Gillespie, U.S. ambassador of the United States, had no interest in Iraq's dispute with Kuwait. But they still invaded. They invaded, and the U.S. said they did have a dispute. He then sent troops. So Bush went crazy. He sent troops to Saudi Arabia, saying that Hussein would take over Saudi Arabian oil reserves. He is a Ku Klux Klan racist, George Bush. He is a Ku Klux Klan Nazi of the American government. He's a butcher of Washington. Okay, so basically all these countries have nuclear weapons. Why is Iraq's nuclear weapons a big deal? It's because they are Ku Klux Klan Nazis of the American government. Bush would claim to withholding the United Nations commitment to defend its member states from aggression. Okay, the UN voted 75-20 to condemn Bush's Panama invasion. The press didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about the Israeli aggression, which was condemned by the UN, the nuclear freeze, outer space militarization, support for the Contra wars. All of these things were condemned, even the U.S. invasions of Grenada and Panama. But the U.S. mass media didn't talk about it at all. They're racist, Ku Klux Klan, fascists is why it is. But when they support the invasion, when they support the Security Council goes along with it, they report it as, oh, now it's our license to butcher the third world people, is what it was. So no major media commentators question the characterization of Saddam Hussein as the butcher of Baghdad, madman, psychologically deformed and beast. The descent of man showing a descending order, a man, a gorilla, a monkey, a snake, and a distorted dwarf, Saddam Hussein, by David Levin cartoon in the New York Times. That is what it is. These people are Ku Klux Klan white thugs, okay? That is what it is. You normal people, and then you have Ku Klux Klan white thugs of the American press is what we should do, the reversal. In short order, 24 of the 25 largest newspaper editorials in favor of Saddam military force to liberate Kuwait and teach Hussein a lesson. Demonizing Iraq's leader, U.S. was able to wage a ferocious war against the Iraqi people, all the while pretending the attacks were against the wicked Hussein. Tom Brokaw asked, when can the United States allow Saddam Hussein to live? Tom Brokaw is responsible for a genocide of the Iraqi people. He is part of the genocidal, Klansmen that murdered the Iraqi people. Once the president began the all-out aerial war, the U.S. news media transformed itself into a virtual cheering squad, identifying totally with U.S. forces, using to describe military actions. CBS's Walter Cronkite crowed, "We knocked one of their Scuds out of the sky." Others talked of the heavy damages we inflicted on Iraqi defenses. The Ku Klux Klan Nazis, Walter Cronkite. And CNN telecaster affirmed, "We have been hearing nothing but good comment from pilots," okay? So everything was going perfect because we're slaughtering civilians. That's what happens, they slaughter civilians. Rather mentioned that the FBI was visiting hundreds of Arab Americans to investigate links to terrorist organizations. The FBI had done a terrific job to defend us against terrorists, said Dan Rather. He is a racist white scoundrel, Dan Rather of the U.S. press. Peter Jennings extolled the brilliance of the laser-guided bombs. Okay, so brilliance of laser-guided bombs, Peter Jennings, murder of Iraqi civilians. That is what it is. They are Ku Klux Klan murders of the U.S. government. While there was nothing but praise for the military, Jim Lehrer of PBS, McNeil NewsHour wondered if the media were doing their job. Has the public been adequately prepared for this war and officials? That's a totalitarian press. A fascist dictatorship's worried if you prepared ideologically the people for your mass murder campaign. It is a totalitarian, fascist, Ku Klux Klan, Nazi American dictatorship. War coverage was tightly controlled by the military. Okay, the major media accepted the censorship with few complaints. NBC team Tom Brokaw was downright sympathetic. Officers remember Vietnam, and in fairness to them, some got burned. So understandably, they didn't want the press to cause the same damage again. Okay? First Amendment gives the right to publish just about anything. These are the comments by the U.S. press. You can publish just about anything. They're, Ku Klux Klan fascists. You can't publish. It's a responsibility. First Amendment does not allow you to defame people and publish anything. It is part of international law to publish the proper stuff. They're Ku Klux Klan fascist American press. It remained for small dissident media like Nation, Guardian, Harper's, and Pacific Radio sued the government. The press wouldn't, participate in the suit. The worst censorship came not from the military, from the press itself. It's one-sided and ideologically loaded coverage and commentary, all ideology, racist fascism of the U.S. government. Indeed, the strikes, they called them surgical strikes. The attacks were surgical in that they systematically destroyed the industrial life support systems of Iraqi society. So they were surgical because they mass murdered and destroyed the life support of the country. 85,000 tons of explosives, free-falling gravity bombs, or the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima atomic bombs. That's what the U.S. used in Iraq. Remember that. A great superpower used its tremendous technological might to pound a small nation into submission. Okay? That's what the U.S. did. CBS Mark Phillips intoned, Saddam Hussein promised a bloody war and here is the blood. They dismissed the casualties. McNeil Lehrer, the casualties of the Iraq conflict, it was all lied. It was all hidden. They did not mention, the major media did never mention the number of Iraqis killed. As with Vietnam, Grenada, and Panama, only American lives counted. NBS News, John Chancellor concluded, the most important thing to be said about the war is that there were very few casualties. British press, London Sunday Times said that 200,000 Iraqis were killed in this war, but there were no casualties. That's what the white press does. They're fascist liars. They cover up murder by their government. It's a racist group of Ku Klux Klan Nazis. Iraqi losses were briefly revealed by CNN's Peter Arnett produced footage from Baghdad of hundreds of deaths caused by the U.S. aerial destruction of a civilian bomb shelter. The media dismissed the incident. Okay, we must point again and again that it is Saddam Hussein who put these innocents in harm's way. That's what it is. You blame the people for your mass murder campaign. When your genocidal technology goes the wrong way, blame the Iraqi people. That's the way to do it. After giving us a brief glimpse of Baghdad casualties, McNeil Lehrer commented or dismissed them as heavy-handed manipulation. So even though there were hundreds and thousands of killed, they dismissed the casualties as manipulation. They said they were lies. They are racist Ku Klux Klan sick whites. Okay? So, they they killed all sorts of troops. They murdered civilian population, destroyed a hydroelectric system, water treatment plants, residential neighborhoods, all of it. The Washington Post carried references to the fantasy some 10 times during the Gulf crisis that, Kuwaiti hospitals were being attacked by, Iraqi troops, and they were, taking infants out of incubators. All lies. They lied about everything. The Iraqi forces slaughtering Kurds and Shiites was Leslie Gelb of the New York Times. A lie. They were lied. They were fleeing Kurds. It was a lie. The slaughter of the Iraqi people was not discussed. They're Ku Klux Klan fascist murderers of the American press. Well, after the war, the dying continued. UN reported the living conditions at a crisis level, hunger, disease, death. And U.S. press, United Nations had once more become an invisible organization. Okay, so when the UN sides with the United States intervention, it is, big pomp and, great thing. But when it is, when it condemns them, they are invisible. It's an invisible organization because they are a fascist group of Ku Klux Klan mentally sick whites. Okay? The press gave almost no attention to what critics said was the real reason for the war, to protect the interests and profits of the oil cartel, to beat another third world nation into economic submission, to boost the military budget, obliterate the talks of peace dividends, and to drive the savings and loan scandal off the evening news, and to bolster President Bush's image as a bold and courageous leader. Lacking critical information and argument to the contrary, the public rallied around the troops and treated this war not as a just undertaking. So the public supported the Iraq war. They are vicious anti-third world, anti-ethnic murderers of the American public. It is an anti-ethnic, racist group of white scoundrels is what the American public behaved in this war of aggression against Iraq. They may have changed their tune later, but they were anti-ethnic, racist scoundrel whites of the U.S. public. Vietnam, Grenada, Nicaragua, Panama, Iraq. When leaders choose to make war, the press joins in. In 1923, British journalist Philip Gebs, they self-censor. It's called self-censorship. That's what the U.S. press does. So inventing reality, the politics of the news media. Michael Parenti, please join me tomorrow for 2 more chapters. Glad you could join us today. Krishna with the Ayathan Tech and Delray Beach. Have a great day.